Hello everyone and welcome to Abhinaya Reflections series. Our topic for today is Insights into Choreography, where we would hope to shed some light on a few aspects of choreography, solo versus group choreography, traditional versus modern, and inclusion of poetry and narration that has been presented by Abhinaya Dance Company since the last 40 years. We have with us Mythili Kumar, who's the artistic director of Abhinaya Dance Company, more popularly known as Mythili Auntie in the Bay Area. Rasika and Malavika, Rasika Kumar and Malavika Walia, both of whom are Mythili Auntie's daughters. And I'm Vaishali Ramachandran, the moderator for today. I would request you all to begin our session today by introducing yourselves and talk about the first time you were introduced into the idea of choreography. What was your first choreography experience? Mythili Auntie, can we start with you?
Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. So I think in the first session itself, I said I'd done some choreography in, solo choreography earlier on in my dance career. But my first full-length solo was for the Ramanavami festival in Keys High School in Secunderabad in 1977 with Papanasham Shivan's Ramacharita Geetam, which is like a full account of the Ramayana. And that was, that was a big venture that I did, the first full production. And then after I came here, I did a few solo pieces as usual for any show that I had. And then in 1986, with our school, our first full production was called Shiva the Cosmic Dancer. And I show this to you. I think you can see that. That was in 1986. And this was done with a few of our dance students. We wanted to show the different manifestations of Shiva. So that's when I embarked upon, doing each, doing it in depth. We did it with several acts, different manifestations, the glory of Shiva, the dance of Shiva, Shiva and Parvati. And then I was introduced to Tiruvembavai, which I'd never heard of before. That was for Shiva the Protector. So that was the first main choreography. It was group choreography, and because it was for the students, it was fairly, I don't think it was very, very difficult or anything. It was very simplistic choreography. The first solo full length I got a chance to do was for when I got the NEA, National Endowment for the Arts Choreographers Fellowship in 1989. And I did Navarasa, the 9 emotions, which is like every piece had one emotion was being portrayed. And I was introduced to, some very unusual scenes, like my mentor in Music Academy was Sri T.S. Parthasarathy, the secretary, and he directed me to Villiputtur Bharatam, where Draupadi laughs at Duryodhana. That was a Hasya scene. And then I myself had Devi Bhagavatam with me, where there's a vivid description of hell. And so I used that for fear. So this is my first full Navarasa, solo production. And that, of course, kept on going to others after that. That's my introduction here. Do you, Vaishali, you want to?
Yeah, Rasika, you want to say something about?
Sure. Yes. So I don't. I mean, there's so many definitions of choreography, so it kind of depends on the definition. I remember just growing up, like we were given smaller opportunities to just do formations, like the steps were already set, but we kind of could make group formations. So that's probably the first taste I got. But then really in college was the first time that I was given the chance to like pick music and do steps like for that music and for a group and think of it from scratch. And it wasn't actually for Bharatanatyam, it was for a Bhangra competition. I was part of the Bhangra team, and so that was actually my first real foray into like really creating something from scratch. But again, it's like you're selecting music tracks and you're doing that. So I feel like the next level in choreography was like, how do you collaborate on the music itself, right? So much is like, what's the research, and then you get into the you actually have a say in the creation of the music and what it should be, and the sort of path that takes. And that I think probably only in 2006, so a few years after college. 2006 was the first time. It was for a solo production I did called Satvikam, and the first piece, Satvikam Shivam, the concept, I think, Amma, you may correct me if I'm wrong, I think that was the first time I actually took a concept from scratch, and then we worked on the music and like putting it all together and coming up with something. That's to my recollection, that's the first thing I did. And then of course it's kind of grown from there, and I've kind of tried to push myself, challenge myself to do more research, more thinking, more creation, more just like different ideas, bring different ideas to life.
I think many of our first choreography experiences are Bhangra songs. So
that's right.
Malavika, please introduce yourself, and what is your first choreographing experience?
Sure. So I think most of you know me, but I'm obviously my auntie's daughter, and I've been dancing with the company since I think started when I was 5. I could jokingly say I started choreographing when I was 5, as I used to say I did my own choreography and would perform just made up steps put together when I was very young. But in terms of when I started to choreograph Bharatanatyam, similar to Rasika, I was choreographing non-Bharatanatyam things in high school. We had a very small Indian population, and so when it came to performing things that were Indian, I was usually called on to come up with something. But with Bharatanatyam, I actually started choreographing for quite a different reason, because I started composing jatis. Rhythm has always been kind of one of my favorite parts of Bharatanatyam. And once I started composing jatis, my mom just said, well, why should I set the steps to them? It's your jati. Why don't you try to put steps to it? And so it kind of blossomed from there. I actually focused more on choreographing, not for myself, but for Adingatram students, because between about 2005, from 2005 onwards, I was very heavily involved in training Adingatram students with my mom during the summers, because that's when I'd be off from college. I'd be home, they'd be practicing, and she would have 8 per summer who she couldn't, necessarily teach them class by herself. It's a hard task for anybody. So, and they were a great resource for me to use to do choreography, because they were so well in practice, and especially the students those years were so eager to do whatever we could throw at them. The fact that they could do a new piece was very exciting. So again, I started with just pieces that I would take and say, hey, I kind of like this piece. Let me try out something to this. Can you try it as well? And honestly, the choreography I would do back then was things I probably physically could not do. I would make it very challenging for them. And they would never say it was too hard, because they didn't want to disappoint me, but I physically couldn't do them. I think my first experience with group choreography, not just choreographing to a piece, but choreographing and coming up with the concept of the piece and music and everything, was not until many, many years later, in 2014, when we did Arjuna. And that's probably the first time that I had the opportunity to come up with music, come up with rhythms and music, and create the piece from start to finish, as opposed to just choreographing to a set piece of music.
Okay. I think talking about choreography, the first thing that comes to our mind is solo versus group. So let's start with solo choreography. Mythili auntie, last week you posted Shambho on Facebook, which was much loved by everyone. We would like to hear more about it. I think for our viewers who have not seen it, I'll play a small clip right now. But after that, it'll be nice if you can tell us your process of how you went about choreographing that. So let me just play that video for everyone. Auntie, could you talk about this?
Yeah.
So beautiful.
So, okay, this piece was first done in 1993 September for a production that I had planned to do on Through the Ages. So it was how dance developed from the beginning to to the present times. And so the first, of course, everybody knows that Shiva was the first dancer, and but almost every composition that we had that we were using or were exposed to were all about Shiva dancing in Chidambaram, the Ananda Tandava, the joyful dance in Chidambaram. So this piece, Bo Shambho, was the only piece which actually was made popular by Maharajpuram Santanam in his kacheris. He was singing Swami Dayananda's piece. And this did not have any reference to Chidambaram at all. It was just a description of Lord Shiva. But, it was not just to do just the dance of Shiva. Where did he dance and how did he dance? So then, my reading of the Abhinaya Darpana came into play, because Abhinaya Darpana is our book for dance. And in that it says Lord Shiva danced when he was dancing in Kailasa. Bharata, the sage, came and he had everything, but he did not have dance with him. And so he was but Shiva asked Tandu, his attendant, to teach him the Tandava, the vigorous aspect, and he had Parvati teach the Lasya aspect. So this particular sloka is there in the Abhinaya Darpana. So I picked that, and then I had this, to describe Sandhya Tandava, which is the dance that in Kailasa, which he danced. I have this big book I'm going to show you. This is Natarajan in Art, Thought and Literature, which I had got in 1986. Now you see it's bigger than me, it's twice my size. I had got it because this mentor had asked me to do a lecture demonstration in Chennai in 1986 on the 7 Tandavas of Shiva. And I got this book, and in this, what I'm trying to tell you here is that the visual imagery of, you can see how many things I have marked over here. So all these things I read at some point or the other. And in this, to get the scene of Sandhya Tandava, I'm just going to read this out to you to see how easily it was to get that, that imagery out into dance, into choreography. So this says, seating Gauri, the mother of the three worlds, on a gem-decked golden throne on the rocky surface of Kailasa, the trident-bearer Shiva portrays his dance at twilight, when all the celestials surround him. Saraswati holds the flute, the veena, Indra the flute, Brahma, as you know, gives the beats. Lakshmi plays the music, Vishnu is playing the mridangam, and all the devas are around him, standing respectfully. And so I used this, and this was the perfect sloka to describe the Sandhya Tandava. And, like this, there are so many slokas in this particular book that actually the visual imagery that you want, you don't have to, imagine it at all. It's all there in slokas, which is what I meant earlier on when I said you have to read a lot. So you read a lot, you read lots of books, you get exposed to a lot of compositions, and all these compositions tell you, all these things, all these various descriptions are already there. And so it was easy. And like I said, if you read the Abhinaya Darpana, you also knew about Tandu, and so somebody said theory is not important, but theory sometimes does come into play, because if I hadn't read it, I wouldn't know how to put that sloka in between the dance in order to project what I wanted, which is Shiva making Bharata learn the Tandava and Parvati the Lasya. So that was the aspect of looking at reading different books and looking at different slokas that are good. Then, of course, in the rhythmic aspects, I've come from a tradition of Rajan, teacher Rajan, whom I talked about, where, we never did diditaita, diditaita, diditaita. We always did different things, like would be tadin ginnatom kadadrakadonta, takka tadin ginnatom kadadrakadonta, takka diku tadin ginnatom kadadrakadonta. That was one of the simpler things, so it was already there for us to think in terms of, rhythmic complexity. So that was one. And then in the same Bo Shambho in the Charanam, in throughout the piece, whatever knowledge you have, you try to bring out, right? So in this one, it says Ganga, Ganga is the one who's, he's holding Ganga on his head. That's all it says, is he's holding Ganga on his head. But in the dance, if you read those slokas, it says, as he's dancing, and you will probably have read it even in, if you've done this piece, Natanam Adinar, which is a very old piece, there itself it says Gangai Tulishitara, she's sprinkling water. In the same way, in the Sandhya Tandava, in these descriptions, it says that, the water is, kind of sprinkling all over from Ganga. The gems on his serpent are, shedding forth all this bright lights. The moon is shedding all this, is sparkling away. And then he's dancing with the elephant hide, which is like a background behind him against the twilight sky. So, as I said, all these things, imagery is just there in books. And, you have to remember it at the right time and bring it out. The final thing in Bo Shambho was, he taught Tandava to Bharata, and Parvati taught Lasya. But as I felt that Shiva, being the supreme dancer, did not have to have an Ardhanari aspect, which means half of Parvati, in order to be doing both Tandava and Lasya. If he was a supreme dancer, he could do anything. He could do hip-hop maybe, or even Bhangra dance, right? So I said Shiva should do both Tandava and Lasya. And of course, Asha, our musician, came forth with wonderful Swara Kalpanas, Kalpana Swaram like piece, swaras that showed the difference, and that's how we finished up with that. So anyway, I just wanted to focus today only on the conceptual aspects, the rhythmic aspects, and the Abhinaya aspects, and talk about music, which is very important for all choreography, at a later point when I will probably invite some musicians, including Asha. And so just wanted to let you know, this is how one conceives things, as several your background, the stiff stuff that you've read, the stuff that you've learned before, comes into play. And this was 1993. There was no internet at that time, remember? And so, it was something that you had to, develop on your own and work out on your own. So that's my take
Actually, on the same note, I want to ask you another question. I see a lot of notes written in your Nataraja book that you just showed us, right?
Yes.
And whenever I have worked with you, I see you writing down, even when you're teaching your students or any small correction, like you watch us perform something. How important is it to make those notes? How important is it to do your research when you're choreographing? I see whenever we see you or meet you, you have these big binders of collections of, since the last, I think 40 years or 39 years, I don't know how, maybe since the first production you have done. Can you tell us more about that?
Well, in general, I think I don't have a great memory. One, so I may be reading all these things, but I don't, I may put all these notes there so that I can refer to it when I want to. So, when I can, I go there and I'll be reading and I'll say, oh, this exactly is what I, want to project. And usually I find that, as I said, basically I find that if I read a lot and if I know all this information, then it's easy for me to put things together. So even all those books that I have, if we pick out a Devi file, you'll find, all the Devi articles that I've read before, or that my father has collected and sent to me. All those are there, including the last, I was just looking through something and I found Narada, the celestial, trickster, or whatever like that. It was a newspaper article that my father had sent me. So things like that, I think, gives you so many ideas. And so that I'm a pack rat. I've collected so much stuff over the years. I hope my girls can use it or somebody can use it. Otherwise, it's all probably going up.
I'm sure we'll put it to good use, Auntie. So moving on, Rasika, I remember talking to you once and you did mention that from the production Maya, the first flute sequence that you had choreographed was one of your favorites. With your permission, I would like to play that for our viewers today, and then we can talk a little more about your process with choreographing that.
Sure, sounds good. Thank you.
So Rasika, could you talk more about your process and what was in your mind when you were choreographing this piece? And before that, we would request the audience not to turn on your videos. Please turn off your videos and mute yourself. Vijayama, I think your video is on. Please turn off your video.
Vijaya, can you turn off your video, Vijay?
No problem. So this one, Krishna, obviously Krishna, of course, is flute. It's a common concept. And so I wanted to, like, why did I pick this concept? I have to remember back a little bit because it's from 2012. But in particular, this one, a lot of how we've done work is we have a show date and then we have a deadline to come up with something. Remember, that was absolutely the case here. And so I didn't know exactly how to, I didn't really know what kind of topic or anything I wanted to do. And so like my mom just commented, like I was reading a lot. And I have book. This is a similar, my book on Krishna with a similar amount of post-its and things. So it's funny, the same thing. And I remember just, this book was given to me by Shanta Raman, Shanta auntie. She's also given me like several other books. I think Vijayama is still, I can still hear her. I don't know if she's
Can you mute her?
having trouble. Sorry.
Mute.
Hi, Vijayama.
Vijay, mute. Can you mute yourself?
Sorry. Thank you. So I remember when I got this book, I just picked it up and started reading without any agenda whatsoever. And, I just went through the whole thing. And again, the imagery just kind of kept popping out to me. Like there was so much, we all know Krishna stories. None of this was new stories, but just the way it was described and the way, just so much of it was, so vivid for me. And I just felt very connected to it. And I felt, okay, I think this is the topic, and there's so much in there. So then once I had the idea, it was like, okay, now what are the different pieces? And like, if I were to make a full show, what are the different pieces? So the first, then I kind of settled on the flute, Krishna's flute, and the mystery of the flute and what that does to people. I think that's, for me, it's one of the most like beautiful concepts about Krishna. Then I wanted to create a piece around that. So then it was about finding lyrics that kind of match that. So it's a little, different process. I didn't have lyrics to start. And so then, of course, I went to my mom and I said, okay, I have this idea. Where can I even find lyrics? And I think she pointed me to the Krishna Karnamritam. And we looked through several verses from there. And I ended up picking 2 verses. And even in those verses, it actually gave more ideas, beyond what I had started, right? So that was like another layer to add to the whole thing. The first verse I picked was about the devotee saying, would I be so fortunate to be reborn as a reed that Krishna would then pick and for his flute, choose for his flute. And I just thought that was so beautiful, that idea of like, that Krishna's breath going through this reed and this devotee, and how that's such a blessing. And so for me, it was a lot about that resonance and that breath of the flute and what that does to people hearing it. And the second verse, Loka Anudmadayan, the whole world is like mesmerized. I mean, it's a very typical description of Krishna, but again, bringing, I use that. So then I had these 2 lyrics, and it's like, okay, what to do with these lyrics? Maybe in another process, I might have just worked with a musician right away and had them set it to music. But we were lucky to work with G.S. Rajan sir for this production, and he wasn't available to meet me until 2 weeks before the show. So there was a constraint there where I didn't really have the luxury of, working with them ahead of time. I had to, so basically I had to create the entire piece with no music whatsoever. And in this case, what I created the whole swaram that you just saw was actually, if you just set it in like taki ta taki ta taki ta taki ta taki ta taki ta te te ditam. That's how I choreographed the entire thing. I had like these very plain jatis that I set, which I still use this technique, like setting very, very plain jatis, because if you set something very plain, you can layer really easily on top of it. It doesn't sound muddled. If you set something very complicated, then you kind of are forced to keep that very crisp and clean in order for it not to sound too much. But I like setting plain because then you can play around within the gaps, and you can have a lot of variation even with that plain bass line. So that's how that first swaram came up. And then of course, I basically put the whole thing together. Then Rajan sir came later and he set it to music. And of course, once he set it to music, it gives more ideas, right? Like the way he's able to, the way he held notes gave me movement ideas. The way he was like hitting certain things would give me like, inspiration for different movements. So that was like another layer. But then even for the piece itself, Loka Anudmadayan, I had this idea to make that rhythmic. So you didn't see it in the clip, but afterwards it goes, but I did it again without music, right? So if I just were to say it, Loka Anudmadayan, Shruti Mukarayan, Shoni Ruhan Harshayan. So I set that in that meter and choreographed again the whole piece based on that spoken meter of the verse, and then only later getting music set to it, you know, until later. So you almost, I was practicing the piece end to end before I got a single swaram. And that was how I created that piece. And then of course, with the music gave a whole nother set of ideas. But yeah, and I love this music. The music is just so haunting and so meditative also, for which I felt was the point of the piece also.
Yeah, I'm not able to imagine that, because I think most of us start with music. We first get music and then we say, let's work on choreographing something. But I think you must have had your life into it at that point in time to work without music. Okay, I have a question for Malavika. Auntie started today, but when she was, you know, talking about you, where she said that, and even you mentioned the same, that many of the students, our Abhinaya students, would love to take come to you during their arangetram, and many of them love to work with you and learn your choreographies because they're very intricate and because of your rhythmic patterns that you put together. Earlier this morning, we also saw your water choreography on Facebook, which was a group choreography. So do you have different processes while choreographing for solo versus group? And which one is easier and which one do you like more?
I think there's challenges to both. I wouldn't say one is easier. Solo does come a little more easily to me because with one person, you're not worried about, with the group, you have to think of formation, filling the space, and not using one person to fill the space, but using multiple people to fill a space. And that's a little harder for me to take some time for me to come through. Whereas solo, it's just one person, and you don't necessarily have to fill space. There's points where you can be just in one spot and doing something, and the focus is much clearer when you're doing that. So there's certain aspects I definitely like about solo choreography. I also think with solo, especially when I work with arangetram students, I'm playing to their strengths. So I'm not, many times I will just challenge them and say, okay, this is what I want you to do. And most of them are too scared to tell me no. So they will just do it. With the group, because it's many more people and it's not always going to be the same expertise, and certain people can't do things, certain people can, I have to play around a little bit more to decide what is the right thing that everyone can do and look synchronized, because that's at the end goal, making everybody look as similar as possible is the goal. Like I said, the end goal. So that does present some difficulties, but I think the difference is when I've been doing solo, because I'm doing solos for arangetrams, I'm never creating a piece from scratch, and that I'm not starting from creating the music, creating the jatis. Sometimes I will write jatis for them, but for the most part, it's a set piece that I'm choreographing to. Whereas with group, especially if I'm doing it for production, that's the one time where I get to be involved in the creative process from the very, very beginning. And that's so much fun to sit and figure out, how do I want this to look, not just the dancing, but the music, the rhythm, the overall feel of the piece. How do I create this? And that's, I really enjoy that part of it. It's stressful for sure, but I definitely enjoy that part of it as well. Oh, Vaishali, I think you're muted.
Did you?
Yeah, I'm going to play a very small clip of one of my favorite choreographies of Malavika, which is the Abhimanyu scene for our viewers. And I would request you, Malavika, to get in detail about your process of choreographing that piece. Mythili auntie was saying something.
Yeah, the same thing. I just wanted to put the Abhimanyu out.
Beautiful, Malavika. Every time I watch that, I really enjoy it thoroughly. Can you tell us more about this?
Sure. So just for context, so anyone who's watching it can understand what the scene is about. So this is from our Arjuna production. This is the scene where Abhimanyu, Arjuna's son, is killed. So in the Mahabharata, the story is that the Kauravas create what's called the Chakravyuha formation. And Abhimanyu knows how to break into it, but he doesn't know how to come out of it. So he breaks in, and the idea is that Pandavas are supposed to follow him in, but they are stopped from doing so, and he's left alone in there. And he successfully beats most of the Kaurava army, but ultimately to defeat him, they surround him, they disarm him, and ultimately all of them beat him at once, not facing him one-on-one as was the rules of combat. So the idea here, so the Chakravyuha, or Padmavyuha as it's called, is typically, it's supposed to be a lotus formation or a chakra formation. And I didn't really think that was something I could translate very well into dance. So what I wanted to do instead was try to create a maze and of multiple layers. And each time Abhimanyu breaks through one layer, he goes into another one, breaks through another one, goes into another one until he's finally in the very middle, but it's surrounded and it's unable to defend himself anymore. So that was kind of the idea I had with creating the Chakravyuha and making it into this formation of just endless mazes and circles and different shapes, not necessarily a chakra, but just different shapes and layers to break through, which is why you can see in the beginning there's 3 different almost circles or 3 different sets, and each time one breaks, they try to rebuild it, and then he just completely annihilates them if you watch further. So the other idea that I had was I didn't want musically a couple of things. I didn't want any rhythm or swarams or anything. Sorry, not rhythm, didn't want any swarams or lyrics, because I felt that just having rhythm really makes that starkness of war and starkness of him dying much more effective. But I wanted a contrast between the rhythms for the Kauravas and the rhythms for Abhimanyu. So that's why you can hear in Abhimanyu, he has voice throughout, my voice throughout. Whereas for the Kauravas, we started with just rhythm. And ultimately the voice that came in wasn't mine. It was our mridangist, Ravindra Bharati uncle, came in and did some shullakattas that I'd given to him, but then he also improvised on them as well to make it a little different and more varied. Also different rhythm cycles for each one. The Kauravas were in Sankirtanam the whole time I was in Chatushram, and ultimately my Chatushram got drowned out as I got more and more overwhelmed by the Kauravas. The other thing I wanted to do was, because Abhimanyu obviously had to have a bow and arrow, that's his signature weapon, and he had to be armed with that and holding that the whole time. I didn't want the Kauravas to be using weapons the entire time. I felt that kind of made it monotonous and too simple. So I tried to think, okay, how can I have them still show that they're fighting without necessarily doing a sword hand or showing a bow and arrow or showing weapon hands the entire time. So we tried to come up with different hands that would show some sort of movement and fighting and like strong poses, but not necessarily weapons. And that took a lot of time, because a lot of redoing, because every time I would do it, I wouldn't like it and we'd redo it. But that was the overall concept of getting this beginning part in and then kind of moving through that entire first section. So And just to explain a little bit more about the entire piece, because that's only the first section. The nice thing about this was I was able to kind of break it into 3 sections. The first being his death, the second being Arjuna's reaction to his death, and the final scene being Arjuna defeating Jayadratha, the king who stops the rest of the Pandavas from following Abhimanyu in. And that was also another point that we had to make different, because the Chakravyuh has one formation of the Kauravas. Jayadratha happens to be, he's being hidden by the Kauravas to some extent in that final scene, so that Arjuna cannot get to him, because Arjuna has vowed to kill him before sunset. And so they try to create essentially a blockade so that he can't reach him in time. And I wanted to make sure those 2 formations were completely different and didn't look the same, and we didn't have the exact same kind of fight patterns or fight scenes between the 2, which was nice that we had that scene in between of Arjuna lamenting, which was completely just Abhinaya, just lyrics. That was the only lyrics that were in the entire section. But yeah.
I think that was a beautiful scene. Another scene from the same production, Arjuna, is where Drona leads the young boys through the exercise of warfare. This scene was choreographed by Rasika. I'm going to play this scene for our viewers, and then we can have Rasika talk more about it.
Learn well the art of war, the technique of wrestling, the skills of fighting with a sword, a mace and a bow, and you will indeed rise to great heights and become beloved heroes.
Jum, jum, take the jum. 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 Jump, that, jump, that, take the jump. That jump, that jump, that jump, that jump, that jump, that take the jump. That jump, that jump, that jump, that jump, that jump, that take the jump. That jump, that jump, that jump, that jump, that jump, that take the jump. That jump, that jump, that jump, that jump, that jump, that take the jump. That jump, that jump, that jump, that jump, that jump, that take the jump. That jump, that jump, that jump, that jump, that jump, that take the jump. That jump, that jump, that jump, that jump, that jump, that take the jump. That jump, that jump, that jump, that jump, that jump, that take the jump. That jump, that jump, that jump, that jump, jump, that jump, that take the jump, 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 that team, that take the team, jump, jump, that jump, that take the jump, 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 that team, that take the team, jump, jump, that jump, that take the jump, 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 that team, that take the team, jump, jump, that jump, that take the jump, 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 that team, that take the team, jump, that jump, that jump, that jump, that jump, jump, that jump, jump, that jump, jump, that jump.
Rasika.
Yeah. Yeah, it's actually, you know, it's interesting. This is back to back with Malavika's thing. Both were the same production, Arjuna. So you can see the
That's
cross.
why we should listen to you first.
Yeah, no, they're the same, and also it's interesting. We've picked two pieces that have a very heavy rhythm, you know, heavy rhythmic aspect. I think that's kind of interesting as well. For this one, it's just like creating this like environment of the Gurukul. I mean, I've never been in one. You know, you can only imagine what it was like in Arjuna's time. You know, if and it's a myth, right? So we can sort of have a little bit of our interpretation of it. But for me, a lot of this was how to create dynamic movements and still bring in like fighting and training and stretching, and those, it should look like something like that, and not just steps. But there's a mix. You can see that we've done a mix of both. And then what I really love exploring in any group situation is just the transitions, getting transitions to, you suddenly have this group, like, this is half and this half, and then suddenly you turn around and now they're pairs, and you're like, oh, I didn't realize that they're now pairs, and then they do a little shift and now they're like lines of 3 or something. I really like those kind of surprising transitions and combinations and things that kind of appear kind of smoothly and unexpectedly. That's just something I enjoy as part of this. So that was part of the, what I wanted to bring out a little bit in this one. Yeah.
You make it sound very interesting. I'm going to quickly move on, but before that, I would like to let our audience know that our speakers will be taking questions. So if you have any questions, do post it in the chat, and we can direct the questions to our speakers. We already see a few questions right here. We will take it in about 2 to 3 minutes after one last question that I have from Mythili Aunty. Mythili Aunty, at what point in time did you start moving from traditional to modern? Or what point in time did you actually start deciding to choose modern concepts and saying, let me explore into some modern concepts of choreography?
I think this is going to be done very briefly because it's already almost 6 o'clock. So I'm just going to share a humorous story with you. When I was in the 8th or 9th grade, my father had a Bengali friend who came to him and said, I want to recite this poetry. In this poetry, I have this demonstration I have to do, and I want your daughter to choreograph for it. And I said, and my father, of course, insists on me doing something. And I'll say, no. And he'll say, no, you have to do it. You have to do it. So that's what happened. He came and this Bengali poet said, Ami purane nashate khelibo ajike morono khela nishito bela. That's all I remember. And I actually, he gave me the meaning. So it's something about the play of death and the wind and all that kind of stuff. So I don't know what I did at that time with my really meager knowledge of gestures and all that, but I did something, and so that was my first introduction to modern poetry and dance. Then after that, in the mid 1980s, there was a friend who showed me Aurobindo's poems, and she wanted me to, on an occasion of his Aurobindo's centenary at Badrikashrama, she picked all these poems for me and said, you have to do this. So one of the first things that she did, there were beautiful poems. Aurobindo's poems are really beautiful, and some of them are really good. There was one which said the bliss of Brahman, and it was so similar to Atilana, where you're showing Ananda, you're showing bliss. So that was English poetry. But the one that really made an impression on me was Savitri. This is the poem of Savitri. This is a really, really, really very, very deep seated poem that I don't think I would have done justice to. But all she did was she gave me the main poem about Savitri confronting Yama, the Lord of Death. So Savitri is this light and Yama is this darkness, and Savitri as a light is enveloping the darkness with light, and that's how she overcomes and wins over Yama. So it's a very different kind of feel to the poet, to the story. So I did that, and that was my first introduction. And after that, I think Rasika also had picked up on that. Then my third introduction was through a modern dance company, Margaret Wingrove. She wanted us to do something, and she was the one who introduced me to Chitra Divakaruni, whom Chitra Divakaruni is a famous I mean, although we're all Indians, and I didn't know about her in the early 90s. It was Margaret Wingrove who introduced me to her. And she had written poems. She had not written novels at that time. She's now a famous author. At that time, she was doing poems. And these poems spoke to my heart because they were all about women and the plight of women in India. And so, one of the first stories that I picked was Sudha's story. I don't think I want you to show that right now because we'll put it at a different time in the YouTube thing. We'll take time questions now. But this, if you get Chitra Divakarani's poems, you read them. They're so beautiful. They describes the problems that women have. This Sudha story, the one that I did, was about a woman, a dancer who gets married and her husband abuses her. So things like that. That's very, very touching. So that was my introduction. So I think we shall move on to questions rather than going on further to more videos right now. And if anybody...
I'm sure our audience would love to see more videos, Auntie, but because of time constraints, let's quickly move on to questions. I have one question from Madhav. I would request our audience to quickly type out your questions for our speakers. So Madhav's question is, what is your experience of watching? Has your experience of watching dance changed how you start choreographing? So the more performances you watch, has it influenced your choreography?
Malavika, Rasika, you want to answer that? Because, one of you can start.
Sure, I'll do quickly. And it's, I have a lot of respect for how difficult it can be. And so when I see something that I feel has that depth, and when I say depth, I mean like the research behind it and the thought and how it all comes together, and really I can really appreciate the kind of work that goes into it, because it's extremely difficult, and it's extremely hard to have a vision about it at the start. You have to kind of be very open to trying things and having your vision adapt and change based on the music that you get, right? Like if you want the influences and the input from the musicians, and so you have to be open to what they are giving, and you have to let yourself be influenced by that as well. So the end product, when you're starting off, I can almost never envision the end product, and to find your path through that can sometimes be very difficult. So when I see someone who I feel has like brought all those elements together, I appreciate it a lot.
Okay. Yeah, we have another question. Have other dance styles influenced your choreography? This is from Ashley. Malika, that question.
I would say definitely. I think both Rasika and I had the privilege of being exposed to a lot of different dance styles, especially in college. But also growing up too, we were, my mom was unique in that she wanted us to learn different dances. She had us learn ballet. Rasika learned jazz. I learned tap. We learned different dance styles, and I would say definitely a lot of different dance styles influenced me in ways of the way I wanted to do things and how I didn't want to do things. For example, when I was much older, I started learning, when I was about, I'd say not older, but about 15 or 16, I started learning tap. And tap is so focused on rhythm and creating rhythm just with your feet. And that really made me, I think that's when I started to get very interested in how do I do that same sort of rhythm? How do I create those patterns in Bharatanatyam and not stick? One of the great things about my mom's, the style and Natarajan's legacy is that the jatis are so complicated and so different, and they don't run the same sort of pattern. But I wanted to see how could I do that myself. And sometimes I would take, just for one example, the song Little Mermaid. I'm a big, as many of you know who are here, I love Disney music, and a song from the Little Mermaid had the Under the Sea song had a really great rhythmic pattern. And I said, okay, how can I take that and put that into dance? And so I found a way to make what we call the Under the Sea jati. and a couple of under the sea jatis, one for Rasika and one which we used in that water piece that you showed. And so while that's not necessarily another form of dance, it's
You say that?
definitely no, that's okay. But it's a different.
You should say that. We would.
Yeah, say it.
Gosh. So the one for Rasika is that's not based on that's based on kind of the background of the song, and it you're putting me a little bit on the spot. So, but I'm not remembering the jati right off the bat, but regardless, my point is that definitely I do use other styles, other music especially. It's been a big influence for me to come up with rhythm, but other styles do really help in figuring out ways to create things and ways to think about something in a different way that may not necessarily be the lens we use when we come to Bharatanatyam. So yes.
Okay, Mal, I remembered it. That's if you, it's like people know the under the sea beginning. So that's the jati that she created for me.
Yeah, and then the other one is goes the under the sea doesn't start on the beginning of the talam, it starts off. So the other one goes you have to wait takadimi takita tatditajam 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 tatditajam. So that's the same as under the sea. Under the sea. So that kind of that pattern, I really liked it, and I liked that it didn't start on the beginning of the beat, which is unusual, especially even in Western music. So adapted that into my own little jati.
This is very interesting because I have seen many people choreograph or use Western music, Bollywood music, and try to do a little bit of Bharatanatyam, do a little bit of Abhinaya for it. But to pick up a music and try to convert it into a rhythmic pattern, I think I'm hearing it for the first time actually, and it sounds very interesting. I think after this, I'm going to go try doing something like that. It's 6:02 and it's time to wrap up. I don't see too many questions right now.
There's one question on Facebook Live. I'll just say it. I think this is mostly for Amma. How difficult is it to choreograph a non-Indian theme like the MLK or Cesar Chavez stories and adapt it to Bharatanatyam? That's from Shamla Ganapati. Shamla.
Yeah, it's my first introduction to that was actually Gandhi, which we did in 1995. My board chair person who was very involved in Gandhi, he was the one who came and said, you should do it's a 125th anniversary of Mahatma Gandhi. You must do a production on Gandhi. And I looked at him and I said, what am I supposed to do about Gandhi? But anyway, that once you've been told that, then, and it's a challenge, you take it as a challenge. So then my first thing was, again, as I said, I took his autobiography, My Experiments with Truth, read that through, read a lot of different stories about him, and then I had another book which says World Without Violence, which talked about all the world leaders who were influenced by Gandhiji. So used that, and then. I wanted to present it in a different way, not Gandhi's story from beginning to end, but I decided that I would present it as Manu Ben, his grandniece, reminiscing about Mahatma Gandhi and how he, so she starts, she was there at his side when he dies, when he's killed, assassinated. So starting with that, the scene at his Rajghat Memorial, starting with that, then she reminisces, goes back to saying, this is what he said, this is what he told me, this is the story he has told me, this is what he did, so it went back through her memories, and she was the narrator who narrated and got it all through. So something like that. So like that, in the same manner, anything, Chavez, for instance, I didn't want to just show the story of Chavez, but I showed the story of a farm worker who was working very hard, and then he hears this call to, strike from Cesar Chavez, and then he goes and he joins him. So, wanted to show it in a different way that would show the effect of Chavez, but not just story-wise. And So essentially that it is difficult, definitely. And sometimes people don't want to see it because they only want to see traditional stuff. And there's so much that we can do in the traditional stuff. But, occasionally in order that we are in a place like, for instance, when I did the Chavez piece many years ago, the city supervisors in San Jose were all Hispanic, Latino. They came and they had tears in their eyes, So, when you do something that is really touching somebody else, you should, I guess, go ahead and do it, even if it's, not something that you want to do all the time.
I just wanted to add to that in terms of non-Indian themes, but also even just like non-traditional structures. It can be very difficult. Exactly what Amma was just saying. People don't know how to absorb it. There's sometimes they're very used to certain ways of pieces and structures, and it can be very hard. So that's something you have to keep in mind a lot. But one thing I've enjoyed doing is actually using the traditional structures to tell like different stories. So that's another way I used in this production that Shakti unveiled. Like, it is a margam, quote unquote. There's a varnam, there are padams, there's a tilana, but the content of it is not traditional. And so in some way it's almost like you use the margam as a vehicle that people understand, right? They understand the structure of how varnam goes, but you can present new content there as well. But certainly with when you don't use the traditional structures, that's probably the most important thing I worry about, is like, okay, how do we make this so that the audience really can follow along and really understands, like, and is kind of being taken along the story with you, instead of just sort of being confused and lost as to what's happening.
I think Abhinaya Dance Company has made it quite clear there is no limit to what we can convey in the framework of Bharatanatyam. Just some closing notes. Maybe we'll start with Mythili Auntie. Something that you want to tell our people and influence them, or tell them how they should work on their choreography. Some tips for all of us today, from all three of you.
Well, from me, I guess, from my point of view, you have to have a lot of, knowledge and concepts that go into before you even start. And of course, as I said, the second aspect, another aspect is music, which we're going to deal with later on, which is such an important element in bringing your piece, to the stage and developing it. So that's what I would say, that you would have to definitely work very closely with a musician, and that's and spend a lot of time in it. And for instance, for me, if I were able to do a lot myself solo, then it works for me. The progression of choreography, it works for me. Like, I know from this I can move to that, from this I can move to that. But if I'm not there dancing, then it doesn't work. So I guess I believe that's what I would let you know, that it has to, kind of flow for you. The choreography, the steps and the movements and all have to flow from one to the other. The meaning has to flow from one to the other. Rasika, Malavika.
Rasika, some quick tips for us?
No real tips. I know that not everybody who's a dancer wants to be a choreographer, and so that's obviously, like, everyone has their path. But I do think that as a dancer, you have to always be thinking. And in that you are already always choreographing something. You're always thinking and tweaking. And I really have, I really encourage, especially a lot of the young dancers, like they're learning all the concepts, but at some point you have to really understand them yourself and go deeper and read a little bit more and make sure you've gone further layers in, like from what your teacher is telling you, and only then can you really bring out what I think the concept is. And again, like, I think we talked about this with the talk about Mami, Kalanadi Mami, but like, it almost never matters, like right hand, left hand, like what hand is doing something. But if you have the story, and if you have the thought, and you have the research and this everything behind you in your head, it comes out. It will actually come through. And so that, even if you don't call yourself a choreographer, you just want to be a dancer, like, you have to have that analytical and thinking mind always, I believe.
Malavika?
I think I would just add to that same, just like not every dancer wants to be a choreographer. The same line is just because you're a dancer, that doesn't make you a choreographer. So you have to have that foundation. You have to have those basics down, not just the knowledge, as Amma talked about. Absolutely, you have to be, especially if you're doing something that requires a story, then you need to be well read on your story. But even just to choreograph simple, basic rhythms, you having that rhythm down pat and knowing what patterns work with what, knowing, even to be honest, with rhythm, it's really just math. And so having a good knowledge of math is so helpful when you're working with rhythm and creating a piece and knowing, okay, how many beats can I fit into a 16 beat cycle? How many can I do in a 9 beat cycle? But at the same time, I also want to say, don't be afraid to challenge yourself, because sometimes you may think, oh, that's a step that I've seen somebody else do. I don't think I can do that. Maybe that's not something I can try. But until you actually incorporate it and maybe just throw it into a piece, you don't know if it'll happen. I've had that happen many times, where there's a step that I'll see another dance group do, and I'll say, that's not really our style. I don't know if I should use that. And then I use it and I like how it looks, and I keep going with it. So not feeling bound by, I think that's kind of what we've been trying to say too. You don't have to feel bound by this, some sort of structure to say you have to do it this way, you have to do it a certain way. As long as it's dance, it's still within the language of dance, you can still choreograph and it'll still come out hopefully the way you want.
I think you must own it, and I think it'll come out beautifully, just to sum it up. Thank you so much, and thank you to our viewers who have been with us today. If you have any other questions, you can post it to our Facebook page, and I'm sure we'll reply to it. And this video will be available on our Facebook page too.
And thank you, Vaishali, for moderating.
Thank you.
And thank you so much.
Thank you.
My
Vaishali.
pleasure, actually.
Bye, everybody. Thanks for joining.
Thank you.